Welcome to another episode of the Almost Awakened podcast. I am Teresa Hobbs,
And I'm Bill Reel.
and today we're going to be talking about purity culture and sexual shame. And we're going to go over how this shows up for people. We're going to talk about the origins of it, where it comes from. We're going to talk about the way it impacts people differently and how to sort of deconstruct from it and heal from it. So to get started, I want to just talk a little bit about, how it impacts people and why it's an important thing to even bring up right now. So purity culture and sexual control systems, they shape our sense of worth, our body image, they shape intimacy and self-trust. And after leaving a religion or a high control system, the conditioning will remain embodied through shame, through numbness, through fear of pleasure, or confusion about consent. And we end up with this internalized self-policing that happens. And healing requires integrating the body, learning to trust desire and pleasure, and reclaiming your inner authority again.
And I'll just say too, Teresa, I think it matters because every one of us has been affected by it. We'll see some of this later as we get into it. But it shaped how I perceived sex, how safe it was to explore sexuality. It affected my children in lots of ways as they grew up in a system. And I think that people will find that practically everyone, and you and the people you love, have been affected by this. And I think this is a great chance to just slow down and notice it and give us all a chance to do something with it.
Yeah. And I think, I don't think there's any woman out there who can't relate to feeling big things around body image, feeling confusion around, how sexual you're allowed to be. If you're too sexual, then you're slut shamed. If you're not sexual enough, you're a prude. So this plays out in so many different areas of life. And I know for men too, I think there's a lot that affects them just in different ways. So we're going to sort of be talking about all those different ways. And I think it'll be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
All right. So I want to start out by just asking people some questions about how it's impacted you. Sometimes just having a dialogue or having some questions can get you to sort of sense into how it's landing in your system. So one is, how do you feel about your body today? And just sit with that. Just think about what relationship do you have with your body when it comes to being able to sense into it or being able to feel any type of sexuality or sexual pleasure. And then, what emotions come up when you think about your own desire or sensuality. What's interesting about this one is, I left the church when I was 20, but I struggled with purity culture the whole way through. It was actually one of the biggest shame buttons for me. There was, I remember, I don't know if this landed the same for you, having joined the church when you were older, because you were like 17 when you joined the church. But when I joined the church and started going to church at age 12 or whatever, the main focus through my adolescence was on purity. I mean, not drinking, but the most important rules to follow in the Mormon church were, chastity, and I just remember, having conversations with my girlfriends and knowing that, if you kissed a boy too much, if you made out too intensely, that was a really bad thing. And so it was always this, it was always presented as this, almost like this cliff that if you got too close, you were going to fall off and something catastrophic was going to happen. And yeah, so it became this really fearful thing for me. And even after leaving the church at age 20, I held on to my virginity till I was 30 years old because this stuff was so deeply embedded in my system. It was so hard to unwind it.
I think these questions are incredibly helpful because we've all been taught things around sex and sexuality and our bodies. I'm thinking of the good girl, good boy sort of expectation that our parents put on us, and for good reasons. There's reasons why we try to teach our kids the way we do, but it certainly lends to us growing up with expectations around ourselves and others that don't really give us a chance to uh, explore who we are in a healthy way. And so I'm really excited to go through the rest of these as well.
Yeah. So another question you can ask yourself is, how has it impacted your ability to engage in sexual intimacy with yourself or others? I know in a lot of religious cultures, well, maybe not a lot. Maybe I'm maybe I'm naive about this, but I don't know how many other religious cultures teach that masturbation is bad, but definitely the Mormon Church does. So that can impact your relationship with yourself and being able to feel a normal sexuality. And then just, tuning in, like, do you ever feel guilt or anxiety after or during intimacy? How were you taught to see sex? Was it,
Mm.
through as love, or was it as sin or something else entirely? Um, so these are just really interesting questions to sort of get at the heart of how it's kind of landed for you. Um, do any of these resonate with you? Like, are you like what on this list sort of like brings to mind like how it impacted you in your life?
Yeah, I look at the second to last one there. Is there a part of you that still believes desire needs to be controlled? And I would hear this all the time in conversations with friends and others if we got into some of these deep topics about how people had been raised and how they'd been uh, hurt, whether intentionally or unintentionally, by family or community. Or and you look at a question like that: is there a part of you that still believes desire needs to be controlled? I know that in my own world, um, I've been I've been taught to see my sexuality as it really did need to fit in a tiny little box, and anything outside of that was my fault, not the world's expectations being wrong, not my religion being untrue. And deconstructing religion and entering a space where uh, I was allowed to be a lot more open about what I wanted and who I was and what my sexuality looked like. Uh, it was really tough to get rid of the feelings that others, put on you through what they do or how they set expectations for you that aren't really healthy for you. And that took a long time. It took a year or two minimum just to really start to get comfortable with who I was.
Oh yeah, totally. And one of these questions too is like, how do you respond when someone else shows sensual confidence or openness? And this comes up a lot for me still. Like, I feel like mentally I've deconstructed it. I know that, the things that I was taught aren't real. Like, they're just constructs. They're rules that are really outdated, honestly. And so I know that they don't have any moral implication, but I still can see myself and people through that same lens. I have a friend that I'm really close with who's incredibly open that way, and I have so much admiration for the way that she like that freedom that she has in her body and her system, and she teaches me so much. But at the same time, I have all these guards up. I'll feel myself, sometimes feeling judgment or feeling like, oh God, why would you do that? You can't. That's letting go too much. You know what I mean? Um, and so I'll try to notice it and just be like, "All right, well, there's that. That's okay." And then I have to sort of address it in my body as well, because it's my body that's informing me. This stuff gets so penetrated in your body that I'm laughing because sort of
No
a
pun
sexual
intended.
word. No pun intended. But anyway, yeah, like it, it's just so interesting. And I think even I don't know, like, I'm still working through this. I'm still processing this stuff. And I was one of the people who, again, obviously if I was a virgin till I was 30, I was somebody who had a lot of guards up. And so it's taken me a long time to sort of let those guards down. And in my previous relationship, I didn't have enough of a trusting relationship with that person to sort of explore that. And so it's an interesting thing being with you, because I feel like you give me that space to have the enough safety to sort of tap into that more. And it's a slow process. It's not something you just shift overnight, but that's my goal, because I can feel I can feel those guards still, and I there's a part of me that really wants to emancipate myself and let myself just have that freedom to just be who I am, to know what I want, to allow myself to have pleasure and connection in that way.
I think
So
a lot of people are going to feel things like that. And I'd love for the audience, as you're listening to this and as you're seeing this slide up on the screen, which question stuck out to you? And would you mind putting in the comments down below which question it was, and what your experience has been, and what you're feeling around that, so that folks can learn from your experience as well.
yeah, I love that. That's awesome. I want to talk about, like where purity culture comes from. And I thought this was so interesting. And I'm not going to go too much into this, but it is a fascinating sort of background. So purity culture didn't start with religion. It actually began with control. And when humans shifted from small nomadic tribes to agricultural societies, land and inheritance became central to survival and power. So we shifted from being cooperative and dividing resources to having a surplus of resources that we now had to divide amongst people. And so to guarantee paternity and property lines, men began to control women's bodies and their sexuality so that they knew that their children would inherit that, property. And so what started as ownership eventually became moral law. And over time, religions and governments sanctified these rules, teaching that a woman's virtue, family honor, and even spiritual worth depended on her sexual purity. And I just think that's fascinating. It makes sense. I understand why it sort of played out this way. We've talked about you've shared about the book Sapiens, and the whole concept of what happens when we move from small tribes of like 150 and under to above that, and how we have to shift the types of social systems we have in those different structures.
Yeah, let me say another thing about Sapiens. So Sapiens, I think it's bigger than this. So Sapiens is a book written by Yuval Harari, and it talks about how humans coexisted, how they collaborated. He puts out sort of evolutionary theory on how humans would have developed. And a lot of the stuff he writes makes sense. It's the reason the book was a #1 bestseller, I think, on the New York Times list. But he points out that in really small tribes, that we get to know each other based on intimacy. So if it's, the family unit, mom and dad and the 4 kids and grandma and grandpa and whatever it is there, and those folks all know each other really well. But once you get above about 25 people, humans don't coexist enough in connection to know each other well enough. But you need that information. You need to know who the best hunters are. You need to know who the best gatherers are. You need to understand whose advice is useful and whose skill sets are worth learning. And the only way to do that, if you don't know people, is someone's got to tell you about that person. And so we humans develop lots of technologies, but one of those technologies is language. And then within language, the technology that came to use the soonest was gossip. And so once you have gossip, you can extend a cohesive unit beyond 25 people. You can extend it into about 150 people. And but once you get to 150, now you and I don't know the person, you don't know the person, and neither does any of the other people in our 25 group of 25. Do they know anyone? They don't know some of those people beyond that 150, and we still need to have information on them. And so the next technology we created was myth. And I'll just say that purity culture is a myth. Mm-hmm. And it makes perfect sense that we created purity culture as a way to give the tribe information so that we could trust each other in how we were going to show up and behave. And if anybody in the tribe didn't behave on the societal code that we had set with our myths, then there would be discipline and punishments, and the way that you create these big moral codes of what to do and what not to do, and what is the penalty for doing or not doing the thing you're not supposed to, is that we have myth stories that make it an agreement among all of us that there is a being out in the sky, and he controls all the things, and these are the rules that he plays by. So who can argue with him? No one. And it gave us a way to impose moral standards and create cultures, and in this instance, a purity culture where we all expect each other to behave certain ways. And you don't need God to do that. I mean, there are folks out there who are atheists who pass along unhealthy messaging about purity culture as well. But in a lot of ways, it originated back then, uh, in times of early religions, as a way to make everybody in the group follow the same rules.
Yeah, and it was needed because, like you said, when you get above 150 people, there are different rules that you need in order to keep sort of order in that number of people. And nomadic tribes, they were really small, and so they had a different culture around sex. It was communal. Child rearing was communal at the time. They didn't have the same sort of need to sort of control because the group sort of kept each other in check. And when we started to, bring in agriculture and more people concentrated in one space, we needed a different type of system. And it went from egalitarian society to a hierarchical society. And that's when, men wanted to then know that they could control or they could know, who they were fathering so that they could pass that whatever land they had acquired onto their children or whatever resources. Sometimes it's food, animals, land, whatever. And so they started to monitor women's sexuality, and they started to create these other myths and rules to manage and control that, which I think is just so interesting. And so, eventually it developed into more complex governments, and then they brought in religious systems to just codify it even more. And so they created these, different modesty codes, veiling and seclusion to control women. They would veil, I can't remember which society it was, but they would veil women who were pure or married, and anyone who was like a prostitute was forbidden to wear any veil. They had to basically show themselves as an impure woman. They like delineated between who was good and who was bad, or who was clean and who was dirty, which I think is interesting. But that's how it kind of got started. And it makes sense that it's, on some level, I know we look at it now and we're like, oh my God, that's horrifying, right? From our perspective, it's barbaric, these things that we've done in the past. But at the time, based on the technology we had at the time and the way people were living, it made sense. And so, things came out like, a pure body equals a good soul, desire is dangerous, obedience keeps you safe. And, we still have some of this. The ancient power dynamics live on today through current religious systems. They shape how we view sex, desire, worth, belonging. And the messaging is also overlapped into secular culture, which makes it hard to escape sexual shame for really anyone. It's not just if you've grown up in a religious culture.
We know some of this too. You were talking about how in more nomadic tribal systems that there was sort of sex was sort of shared among the group in a way, like anybody would sleep with anybody. And we know this because, or at least we have a high degree of confidence in this because of books like and research by folks like the book Sex at Dawn by Christopher Ryan and Cecile DeJetha, which shows various societies in our world. We have our Western lens, we see this American culture, and that's what we know. But there are places in the world where people still live in nomadic systems. And many of those systems operate the way we just talked about, where the women are having sex with all of the men in the tribe to the extent where when a child is born, their cultural narrative is that that child is part of all the men who had sex with her. And so we know that that's how things work because there are places in the world where it still works that way.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because I've heard people use that, like the old way that we were, like, the old communal way of being, and using it to justify that is how we're wired, right? Like that, because I think it's only been like 10,000 years since agriculture was invented, right? So we've lived in these sort of purity culture systems for 10,000 years, but for like 190,000, almost 200,000 years before that, we lived this other way. And so I've heard people use that rationale to say, like, well, we're really supposed to be non-monogamous, this, like, monogamy isn't even natural, and like all this kind of stuff. And I've had this part of me that's just been like, oh, like, like, again, because it's so embedded in me, the idea of letting go of that control um, is so strange. And I don't really know where we're going to end up as a society, because I feel like, and I want to go to the next slide just to talk about, like, why we no longer really need the old systems. Like, they just don't fit anymore. But we're in this sort of in between place of, like, what we no longer need, and trying to figure out where we transition to. So I don't know that it's going to look like what did before. It's going to look like something probably totally new, and it already is. But so historically, some of the reasons why these systems did work, why they were necessary, was that childbirth was dangerous. Maternal death rates were really high. So a woman getting pregnant was dangerous. What's the word I'm looking for? Sketchy, we'll say. Land and inheritance defined wealth and power. There were no reliable methods of birth control or paternity testing. So, a man couldn't guarantee who his offspring were. Women's survival.
By the way, it's only
Yeah.
the last couple of hundred years, maybe 300 years or so. And I know that, like, in the 1800s, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, I know that there was birth control methods around. And so I'm going to assume maybe another 100 or 200 years. But you get to a certain point, if you go back far enough, there is no birth control in the way that we think of it. And hence sex, the risk of sex is you are likely going to get pregnant if you keep doing that.
Yeah. Which was risky for a woman. And it was especially risky for a woman who didn't have a man to depend on, right?
Yeah.
Because women were dependent on men. They had to belong to a household in some level. And it wasn't allowed to raise a child in your parents' household. That was seen as negative. So yeah, there was a reason why that was necessary, and controlling women's sexuality helps societies to prevent disputes over lineage and inheritance, to manage population growth within limited resources, to protect family alliances and social hierarchies, to reinforce loyalty, obedience, and cohesion within the tribe or state. And I was reading somewhere where they talked about how the societies that had the most cohesion, or the most what's the word I'm looking for? It would almost be like nationalism, like the people who shared and caught on to the same myths or rules, or and had some level of group cohesion, were the ones that fared better. They did better than the groups that didn't. So the more control people had, the whatever rules they had that reinforced control seemed to bring people together in a more cohesive way at the time, even though it has negative consequences, right?
Yeah, and you can even look around and notice that today. So if you look at groups that have tons of cohesion to them, they generally have some degree of control that's being put on all the members of that group. And
Yeah.
I think of the Amish.
Mm-hmm.
I think of Mormons for sure. I could go to other high demand religions like Scientology or Jehovah's Witnesses. There is a lot of group cohesion and unity. We're the good guys, the bad guys are out there somewhere in the world. We're the ones that are led by God, and we know what we're doing. We know where we're supposed to be. And it doesn't require a hardcore religious component. I mean, Scientology, if you get up high enough, it does. But at the very beginning stages, the people who jump into that and take it seriously, they're not really learning a ton of theology on the front end. But the group does have a lot of control mechanisms that do build sort of a forced loyalty, and also a lot of unity within the group.
Yeah. I think the same is true even for nationalism in, different countries and whatnot. So
Uber
until
right.
patriotism, yeah. Until we figure out how to do it a little differently, to some degree, it really is important. So, which, I've always looked at patriotism with disgust. I don't like it. But I also see that there's value in it. So what's interesting is that today, we now have birth control, we have paternity testing, we have legal systems that protect inheritance and property rights. We have medicine, education, and financial independence means for women. So women don't have to be attached or dependent upon a man anymore. We have modern economies that rely on creativity and autonomy rather than obedience or purity. And then information and connection move across the world instantly, and moral control is really no longer sustainable. We can't enforce this the same way that we used to. So it's really not necessary. Like these purity rules and regulations no longer fit, and now they just tend to limit growth, they limit intimacy, and they limit authenticity. So we're sort of moving from one system to another, and like I said, like I don't know what it's going to look like. I think it's interesting how it's already unfolding, and you can see the old system still sort of like holding on. You know what I mean? Trying to hold down those same sort of ideals, and the new, there's other people that are sort of like trying to break free of that.
Yeah, and the bottom left there, where you say controlling women's sexuality helps societies too, and I just want to say these are still good things. What I mean by that is to prevent disputes over lineage and inheritance is a positive. To manage population growth within limited resources, that's a positive. Protect family alliances and social hierarchies, positive. Reinforce loyalty. And again, some degree of obedience is necessary in a society. Also cohesion within a tribe or state. Those are all needed, and they were needed then, and to some degree they're needed now. And so, yes, we're in some sort of shift where we don't need the world to be set up the way it was 500 years ago. We're moving into something new and different. I mean, we live in a technological age where things move faster than we can even imagine.
Oh, yeah.
And we're going to need to, and we're already in the midst of finding ways to give people more autonomy and allow people and groups of people to be more open about who they are and how they want to show up in their life.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk just a little bit, just touch on how purity culture spills into secular society, because, we often think of it in terms of religious systems, but it's permeated our entire secular society as well. So, this shows up by, we still judge women more harshly than men for expressing sexuality, like slut shaming versus celebrating conquest. Like men get to celebrate their conquests and women are slut shamed. We label sexually confident people as too much or attention seeking. I think we were watching a show last night. It was actually really interesting. It was a reality show.
MILF Manor.
MILF Manor. Yeah. I don't even know how we found it, but we were watching it for a little bit, and it wasn't that interesting really, but it was interesting from the perspective that there were all these different characters, and there were these older women who were, who they brought on their, a bunch of younger men, essentially. And you got to see how each of these women sort of inhabited a different personality or a different level of sexual openness. And a lot of them had shared that they were very, had a high sex drive, loved sex, and loved having sex with younger men. And there were a couple personalities in there that were just really out there, right? Like we would be like, wow, you're too much, or you're trying to seek attention, or like, what is this about? And I, again, caught myself judging, like, and being annoyed by certain people's behavior. It was really interesting.
They're just being their brand of human.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. So, and even if it goes to here, like we moralize women's clothing, but we ignore men's behavior. Yeah, there's so many different ways that we do this. We shame bodies that don't fit narrow beauty or gender norms. That's a huge one. And again, I catch myself doing this all the time. Like, say somebody's wearing an outfit that, I don't know, we think doesn't really look great on them, then we'll judge and we'll be like, well, you don't have the body for that. Or, or that's too outrageous, or whatever it is, And in reality, who does that hurt?
Yeah. You've got the one here. We frame male desire as uncontrollable and female desire as dangerous. Humans are humans. And again, there are differences between men and women for sure, but we shouldn't have different rules for men and women. We shouldn't go, well, men will be men, boys will be boys. But girls have these and women have these responsibilities to go above and beyond so that the men will have a better chance of controlling themselves. That doesn't make sense. If we're going to have a society in the modern age, it has to be reason. It has to be it has to allow people to be as much of themselves as they want to be, so long as they don't hurt anyone. And
Mhm.
it needs to, whether it's the color of your skin or the gender that you are, it needs to make it so that the expectations we have about what is healthy and what is responsible is the same between men and women and black and white and any other homosexual and heterosexual, for
Yeah.
instance.
Yeah, so these are just all the different ways that it kinda shows up into secular society. We don't get to avoid it, even whether we've been indoctrinated into a religious culture or not. All right, I wanted to take a minute and just let everybody know that we would love for you to subscribe to our new channel. We're gonna separate the Almost Awakened podcast and put it on its own channel, so it's no longer under the Mormon Discussions, handle. And this will give us the opportunity to sort of have a greater reach for people. And so we're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. And when we get to 1,000 subscribers, we will just move everything over fully onto its own channel. Right now, it's going to be on both channels for a while until we're able to kind of move it over. So if you can take a minute right now and just go to the show notes, you'll have a little link that will take you to this new channel, and just hit subscribe so that we can bring as many people over that are interested in following us on for this particular podcast. So that would be awesome. We'd really appreciate that. And then I wanted to also just take a minute to let people know that we have started, I think we've announced it before, the Religious Deconstruction and Religious Trauma Support Group. And our first group is full. And we have a wait list now for a second group. So we have people on that wait list that are interested in starting a second group. And if you would like to be part of that, you can go to the link in the show notes as well. That will take you to this page that will allow you to click a link that will, you can send an email and say, I want to be on the wait list. And as soon as we have enough people for that, we will start another group. And we've been having such an incredible experience with our first group. So we'd love to make this open and available to as many people as possible.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, we've already got a waiting list started. There's already a handful of people on that. And so we just need a few more of you to be interested, and then we'll get that second support group off the ground and running. So if you're listening to this conversation, you're going, I've been affected by things in my life to the extent that I'm not able to show up my best, healthiest self. I need some help processing, some support and resources to help process the things that have happened to me. I'd like somebody to talk to and to have a way to work out some of the things I'm thinking in my head. Then I think this is a great place for folks. So please consider doing that.
I just want to touch on the psychological and somatic impact of sexual shame. Purity culture doesn't just shape belief, it shapes biology. And I was talking about this before, like I feel it in my body. And I think if you just take a minute to consider, some of the questions we asked earlier on, you can feel those questions resonate in your body. When sexuality becomes associated with danger or sin or loss of worth, the nervous system wires safety with suppression. And over time, that conditioning can get lodged in both your psyche and your body, and it can manifest as chronic tension, as disconnection, and even illness for some people. So shame in the nervous system from a polyvagal perspective. And if you don't know what polyvagal theory is, I've done, I think the first episode you and I did was on the nervous system, and it talks about polyvagal theory. So you can go back and listen to that. But from a polyvagal perspective, repeated messages that sexuality is unsafe condition the body to associate arousal with threat. So the sympathetic nervous system, otherwise known as your fight or flight system, can activate during intimacy, and it can lead to anxiety or performance fear or disgust. I don't know if anybody has experienced that in the midst of sexual intimacy. I definitely have. Um, the other thing that can happen is the dorsal system, it's your shutdown system, can engage, and it can lead to numbness, to lack of sensation, or dissociation during sex. And this is extremely common for women. Less so for men, I think, but definitely for women, where you either can't reach sexual peak, you can't feel anything, like your body goes numb, you feel disconnected from, like, the neck down. Or you can dissociate during sex and just sort of like get through it. And this is really pervasive for a lot of women. And we've just sort of learned to kind of deal with it. But honestly, women women's bodies are built to experience pleasure to the same degree that men's are, and I feel it's really a disservice that women aren't able to feel that when they've internalized so much shame and disconnection and suppression in their nervous system. And yeah, the body learns to leave to stay safe. That's its way of sort of managing it because, we have this sort of split that happens in our system where we have the natural response of sexual arousal, and then we have the mental control mechanism that tells us that it's wrong and bad. And so we have to sort of try to disconnect and shut that down, which causes us to become numb in many ways. I don't know. I wanted to ask your opinion on that just because, you know, obviously men don't have it doesn't show up for men in the same way. If men can engage in sex, they're typically experiencing pleasure, is my assumption. But is it ever possible for a man to feel disconnection during sex or feel disconnected from sexual pleasure? I don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I may have a little difficulty answering this because I grew up in a home that had a fairly healthy view of sexuality. And so when I came into religion in my late teens, I brought a healthy view of sexuality with me on some level. And certainly, certainly my religious system laid out expectations of me, and I definitely felt suppressed about things, but I don't ever remember that showing up in my sexual experiences within my marriage, for instance. And I came to my marriage as a virgin, and so it was the only relationship I knew.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I know it definitely impacts men's ability to, there's erectile dysfunction, and things like that. So, it can affect a man's ability to perform in that way. But I was just curious if, I don't know, and then if anyone has any comments on that, I'd be really interested to know, like, is there such a thing as numbness? I know that men can maybe be sometimes disconnected from their emotional state um, during sex, but I don't know. Anyway, I want to talk about a little bit about like the somatic manifestations. So people can often experience, and again, this is very connected to a woman's experience, but I think this shows up for men in different ways too. Muscle tension in pelvic and abdominal areas, difficulty relaxing into pleasure or receiving touch, shame spirals after intimacy, compulsive control. So you can, become hyperfixated on controlling your eating, your appearance, your morality, or your cleanliness. For a lot of people who have connection to sexual shame, they are perfectionistic. They have like issues with making, like OCD, obsessive compulsive behavior, where they have to, they're sort of like fixated on cleanliness and keeping things like super clean. This shows up for me a lot where, like it's really hard to, I don't know, it's like a representation of my own internalized feelings of not wanting to be perceived as unclean. And I know it has a sexual nature connected to it, so it's really weird, and even though I'm aware of it and I know that it's there, I still have a hard time letting that go, letting my house be dirty or getting to a certain point. Like, I will feel I feel it in my body, and it's really, really uncomfortable. So that's something I still haven't fully addressed because it's just easier to play out the adaptation to that than it is to kind of sit with it and work through it. So, I don't know if anyone can relate to that, but, yeah, there's also freeze or dissociation when confronted with desire, nudity, or sexual imagery. This can happen for a lot of people too. I had a hard time for a long time feeling comfortable being naked. Even it still shows up a little bit for me, because there's associations around nudity, and being too free or too open or whatever it is. Yeah, so that impacts me. And then there's lots of health issues that can be linked to chronic suppression, like fatigue, pain, anxiety, digestive tension, and sexual dysfunction. And I wanted to mention too, like the muscle tension in pelvic and abdominal areas. There are so many women who have pelvic issues. that are tied to sexual shame, but it shows up for men too. I know there are quite a few men who deal with pelvic pain or pain in their genital area that can be connected to sexual shame.
And I think this is, this extends far beyond the realm of like purity culture and sexual shame. But when you have to wear a mask, when you have to pretend to be a version of yourself that you don't want to be or wouldn't choose to be if you had safety, it's inevitable that it's going to affect you. And as you're pointing out, some of the most serious ways it affects you is somatically, that you'll feel it in your body, that you'll have issues that have to do with your health or how you feel that are in relationship to the things that went wrong in your childhood or the ways in which people tried to control you in life. And so I think this is a big deal to go over all of this.
Okay, so I want to talk about the physiology of repression and control, and this applies mostly to men. But from a nervous system lens, chronic suppression keeps the sympathetic system or the fight or flight system humming beneath the surface. And the body needs release, but the mind forbids it. So that can lead to this internal tension inside. And that tension often converts to anger, irritability, and moral rigidity. So some men can externalize the internal battle through domination, through pornography addiction, through infidelity, or moral policing of others. And I don't know like how many times we've talked about this where like we've seen some leader in our society that is like this morally righteous, morally upright, rigid person, and then you find out they have like child pornography addiction or something. Like there's some like whatever degree of control and moral rigidity they have, there's almost an opposing opposite of somehow it's escaping through their system. It's showing up in these very unhealthy ways. And so it's interesting when you hear about people, in the news or whatever, who are found out to have some kind of horrible thing going on, some sexual perversion of some level, and you find out they're like this upstanding moral person in the culture. Like, it's like, oh, I would never guess that John would do that. Like he was so amazing. And, so it's really interesting to see that. But this is why, like there's this repression and control cycle that you can't shove everything down. It's gonna come up and out some way, and often it comes out in really negative ways.
You look at around certain stories come to mind. The minister who the thing he preaches against is sexual sin. Meanwhile, gets caught having seen 200 prostitutes. Right?
Yeah.
You got George Santos, the Washington politician, who earlier in his life there was evidence out there that he was either transgender or cross-dressing or doing various things, but then he gets into politics and he hammers on those people, anybody who is different, and then all that comes out to it comes forward and it surfaces, and suddenly he's looking like an absolute hypocrite, and to the extent where he even got into legal trouble and had to go to prison. There are numerous instances where the thing that you watch the person, the thing that they preach against, criticize, they're the ones who are struggling with it. So you saw, like in your slide here, you had that ends up being a moral rigidity for them, or they end up policing others. Because if you were told by, the reason I'm stammering is because we were watching this TV show on Netflix about the serial killer Ed Gein. And Ed Gein has all of these repressed behaviors because of the way his mother was with him. She expected him to be a good boy and not to get naked, not to masturbate, not to have sex. And it's just normal human behavior to want to be any of those things. And so when people are feeling a lot of suppression, when they're told by their parents they can't be a thing, they're taught by their parents to hate the thing that they deep down are, it will come out in these really big extremes where the person lives a public life condemning certain things, and then privately that's all they want to do is be that thing, and eventually that gets the best of them, and it shows up in the most unhealthy outward expressions, outward manifestations of that thing they should have been allowed to be in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what it says down here. It says, when you can't safely feel your own power, you'll try to control someone else's.
Yeah, we were just listening to an interview with Brene Brown on Diary of a CEO, and Brene said something like, unhealthy groups will always, from time to time, criticize, create rules around, and work to marginalize vulnerable groups, because that's how they signal to the rest of the group that that they're still in charge and they're the boss.
Yep.
And so you see that play out, that if people are raised in systems where they try their best to fit the mold and be the thing, and they're experiencing success, because once you start experiencing success, you can't step out of it. You have to stay in the system. So it's often the ministers and the church leaders and the high up politicians. It's often those folks, because at a young age they thought they could be what the world wanted them to be. They compromised themselves, they put the mask on, and they start experiencing success to the point where now they're too far into the game to show up being their healthy version of themselves. And so now everything has to be done in the shadows if they're going to start to express that.
Yeah. And I just want to ask you a question about that, because, you and I have had conversations around that, and it's a very important value of yours to not let that happen to you. You know what I mean? Like, to feel like you don't get caught having to be inauthentic in your public facing role.
Yeah, I made a decision a long time ago, even when I was in as a believer, when I was doing the podcast, and people were looking to me uh, to set an example of a faithful perspective. I just determined even back then that I was going to start being vulnerable. And it wasn't like an active choice, like, oh, that's me, I'm going to be vulnerable. It was, I tiptoed out there because I wanted to be vulnerable. I stepped out there and I said something, and then I waited for the negative reaction. And what came out was almost entirely all positive validation and appreciation for someone saying the thing that they also are thinking inside their head, that it gave me the confidence to just keep stepping out there.
All right. I want to talk about how purity culture impacts us differently. So, there's different ways it impacts women versus men versus queer people. For women, it teaches women that their value comes from being pure or untouched, makes them feel responsible for men's thoughts or desires. It creates shame around their bodies, around pleasure or their clothing. It encourages self-judgment and fear of being seen as, too much, like we talked about. And it disconnects them from confidence, desire, and body trust. And I was wondering if you would read the ones for men and tell me like what around that connects with you.
Yeah. So how purity culture impacts men. It teaches men that their desire is dangerous or sinful. I definitely feel that. As a man, you're constantly aware that even if you practice enthusiastic consent, even if you practice the idea of reasonable requests, you make it safe for people to say no, that any effort to get intimacy, get your needs met from the facet of intimacy, has a risk to it, that you will be, even if you have the best of intentions and you have educated yourself and you try to operate in the world in a way that is completely healthy, you still realize that all it takes is one person to misunderstand you, or perhaps they came to the situation with their own woundedness, and you're going to be seen as dangerous.
Mhm.
And so that's a huge risk. I think the Me Too moment, men pulled back to some degree, and because they didn't feel safe, and sort of withdrew from a bit of some of the facets of the dating world. And I think you saw some of that negativity play out in some of the data and survey results and research that came out that showed that men and women weren't dating in the same way that led to long-term relationships as they used to. Men had sort of gone into hibernation. And what women were reporting suddenly is that there weren't that many good men out there anymore who were sort of testing the dating world because they had been burned too many times. And I say all of that to say that certainly there's a ton of unhealthy men out there and a lot of bad behaviors. I'm not trying to give cover to it. I'm simply speaking to those who try to act responsibly. It says here, pressures to control, hide, or prove their sexuality. Yeah, men are expected to fill certain roles. Women are expected to fill certain roles. And so men within the roles that the society has assigned to them, they've got to show up certain ways. And if they don't, it's a big risk. If a man shows up too emotional, if he doesn't show up being in charge of the sexual experience, for instance, there are lots of these things that are running below the surface. Another one here is links masculinity to dominance instead of emotional honesty. Yeah. You see the men who have really unhealthy egos and the way that they get validation for their manhood, their masculinity is to be cruel, be bossy, be mean, be aggressive. And, Brene Brown in one of her books mentions that a man came to her and said, I love the work you're doing. I feel like as a man that I'm expected to stay on my horse, that people tell me like, no, you can be emotional. You can be in touch with your feelings. You can be a healthy, emotional man. But the moment I lean into that, everyone around me that needs me to be the strong one, the protector, the boundary holder for the family, suddenly they feel like maybe I can't hold up these other roles if I'm allowed to be emotional or in tune with my feelings. And so we've got to do a better job of allowing men to be in touch with their feminine traits as well, and to be emotional. We want men, if women want men who are emotionally available, then you got to make space for men to be emotional.
Yeah. Well, and you've shared that with me. That's been a big one for you in your life. So
yeah, and it impacts how I showed up as a disciplinarian with my kids. It impacted how I showed up, emphasizing that I could take care of the provider role, but that I wasn't very good at the emotional availability role. And part of that goes back to even in childhood where I had parents that didn't teach me those things. The next one here is makes real intimacy difficult because of guilt or fear. I have definitely heard stories of men who bring their woundedness from their childhood into their relationship, and guilt and fear are big walls that prevent them from being their best and healthy selves. And the last one here is disconnects them from tenderness, vulnerability, and empathy. I definitely know men in my world who, going back to that earlier line of where they were pressured to control, to hide, to prove dominance instead of emotional honesty. This goes right along with that they avoid their tender side. They disconnect from it. They avoid vulnerability. They disconnect from it. They're not empathetic. And the way that they get their validation from the world around them is to show up really firm and disconnected and aggressive.
yeah, I see that a lot, and I don't know what the statistics are. I'm making a guess here, but I assume that people with narcissistic personality disorder are skew more to men than women. I know it definitely shows up in women, but essentially, narcissistic personality disorder is like a total lack of empathy. But it's an adaptation to trauma. So I think that's really interesting because I think men are conditioned that way. So how purity culture impacts queer people. I can't speak to this from experience, but it says here that it erases or condemns their identities as wrong or shameful, which is very understandable. It forces them to hide who they are to stay acceptable. There's so many people that have had to stay in the closet for a huge portion of their lives, that you know, it's becoming a lot more normalized now to be accepting of that and to be able to come out and be who you are. But I still think it's a very difficult challenge for so many people, especially if they have families that are very unaccepting. It creates, you know, because it creates a deep fear of rejection from the family or from faith communities. And that's something that you see a lot of in Mormonism in particular. There's, yeah. Um, it teaches them that love and belonging require self erasure, um, and that it causes lasting shame and confusion about desire and safety. So,
Yeah, they've that community has sort of a double whammy. They're growing up with all the same messaging that you and I got, and then they have this whole other line of messaging that because society, or at least parts of it, and it's certainly gotten better, but parts of it haven't figured out how to integrate people who are different. You know, you go back in time and the Bible wasn't very fond of left-handed people. And you go to the 1950s and earlier, and racism is such a big deal that people, just by the color of your skin, you are something less than another person whose skin color is different. And here we are in 2025, and this is sort of the culture of our time. This is sort of the issue of our time, where we have to sort out how to be good to people who are different than us.
yeah. All right. So, deconstruction. What is the aftermath of purity culture? So, when people start to deconstruct, you know, you're moving from repression to exploration to healing. And leaving purity culture often starts in the mind. So we have this realization that, like, wow, okay, that stuff wasn't real. You know, all the teachings that I had about sex and desire and morality, they don't match truth or my lived experience or anyone's lived experience, really. And after years of holding everything in, the body and the psyche can swing to the other extreme. And I've heard about this for a lot of people. I'm the opposite. So some people go through like more exploration, and some people go through where they take on more risk and whatnot. And other people stay frozen and avoidant, and they're unable to engage sexually or emotionally because the fear still lives in the body. So it's really, really normal. Both sides of these are really, really normal. And it's okay to do that exploration. I don't know if you have anything to say about this. It's something that a lot of people talk about in the Mormon culture, you know, when it comes to religious deconstruction.
Yeah, when I started deconstructing my faith system, you know, I gravitated towards this idea that I wasn't anything wrong with me, that, you know, again, part of it was due to the not joining until I was an older teenager. So I have a family that parties, that drinks alcohol, that uh, says funny things that maybe aren't prim and proper, and they let loose a little bit. And so as I deconstructed the faith system, I just looked back at where I came from and realized, like, oh, like, this is what normal humanness is. And I was a little afraid of being seen, as you're making that transition, right? For folks who are out there who are in the church, they're beginning the deconstruction process. They don't quite feel safe completely stepping away. They're going to have to still navigate this, I think, in a way that's sort of difficult, because in some ways you still have to keep up appearances. And I don't mean that in a what's the word I want to use? Well, I'll just say that, you know, they may need to still keep both worlds intact. And so they may have to be careful. But I felt pretty safe going out with friends and having a drink. Um, you know, beginning to talk to my ex-wife about what my sexuality looked like, and beginning to ask questions about what that would mean for our relationship. Um, I think I think a lot of people go from that repression, as you point out. I mean, they can certainly just shut down and stay in that repressed state for forever. And a lot of people do. And as you also point out, your story was different. You moved from the repression to the healing. Um, But for me and for a lot of others, it really is a matter of needing time to. We had a friend the other day. We went out to dinner with a couple, and I'm sorry I'm stammering, but we went out to dinner with a couple, and he was a never Mormon, and he pointed out about how he did his fun exploration as an older teenager, a young adult, and he goes, "You ex-Mormons always are doing this in your 40s." And I said, well, yeah, I mean, you're in a system and then you leave the system and now you want to see what it's like to have experienced the things that you should have been allowed to experience safely long time ago.
Yeah.
And so you see people go really far into sexual exploration, into trying different, whether it's alcohol or psychedelic substances. And people are just trying to figure out, like, if the rules don't matter and if the authorities who laid out the rules aren't who they claim to be, then how do I figure out what's real and what isn't, and what has meaning the way I thought it did, and what I need to change the meaning about things, what things I need to change the meaning about them. And the only way to do that is by exploration. The only way to do that is to step outside and, either got to read a book, go to a place and talk to a person, or you got to experience it yourself.
I did the book reading. That was part of my exploration. No, like, I was 30, I got into my first relationship, my first like sexual relationship, and that lasted for like 6 years. And then shortly after that, I got sick. And then I didn't get into another relationship for like 12 years. I really couldn't at the time. And so I did. I read a lot of books. That was a time where I sort of reconnected with my own body and my own sensuality and sexuality, personally. And I'm still evolving this. I'm still in the process of reclaiming my own autonomy, of understanding who I am and how I express my sexuality. And it's an interesting time. And yeah, I'm 48 years old, and this is just happening now. And I didn't get to do this when I was younger. But you have different people that will, they'll open up their marriages. They'll, they deconstruct Mormonism, or they deconstruct some kind of religion that told them what they could and couldn't do, and they start to get curious about what's possible. And so I know we still have a lot of social judgment around those kinds of things, but it's really, really normal. And nobody should be judged for how they move through this process. And, so what I really want to do here is just normalize how it is for everybody. I was, by the way, incredibly humiliated. I was so embarrassed to be a 30-year-old virgin. In fact, I remember when I was in the process of engaging with this person who I ended up in a relationship with. I was just like, man, I just got to turn in my V card like this. I didn't even tell him. Like, I was so embarrassed about it because I felt like I was so wrong. Like, it was like, what's wrong with you that you can't just function like a normal person, So there's so many ways that it can affect you. And just know that you're okay as you are, and as you're sort of messily moving through this process to figure it out.
Yeah, I
Let
think
yourself have that.
I think it's an important note. It's perfectly normal to be asexual. It's perfectly normal to be hypersexual. It's perfectly normal to be homosexual. It's perfectly normal to be heterosexual. It's perfectly normal to want to touch yourself. It's perfectly normal to not want to touch yourself. Once we make it okay, again, as long as we're talking consensual adults who are informing each other so that everyone can make informed decisions around how they're going to live their life, everyone should have the space to be whatever brand of human they want to be. And in systems like Mormonism, I mean, so many of us were manipulated into not dating much, certainly not having sex outside of marriage, marrying the first person who we have any sort of like, yeah, I think I could live with that person, and not having the room or space to figure out who you are, what your sexuality looks like, what you are attracted to, what is compatible with your kind of human, and the safety to explore that over and over and over again to figure out what works and what doesn't.
Yeah.
So that when you finally do get into a long-term relationship, that you're deeply aligned with the person.
Yes, and to not judge yourself for your body count, so to speak, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, being able to do that in a way that works for you without having this layer of judgment on top of it. As long as you are being safe and consensual, you have the freedom to do whatever you need to do.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I want to just touch on here like the emotional phases of deconstruction and the emotions that we can sort of touch into as we start to process this. And this is something um, when I was putting this together, when I was sort of doing the research to figure out what I wanted to say on this topic, oh my God, there were so many emotions I touched into. And I have layers and layers and layers of just grief and sorrow that are connected to this for, lost youth, lost experiences, the weight of so many years of suppression and pain. Like, I think that's the biggest one. In fact, I'm starting to feel things right now as I'm just saying this. It's It's sad, it impacts so many people, but there's a lot of emotional pain connected to this. You can feel anger at systems, at leaders, or, at beliefs that moralize control and called it holiness. Um, you can feel into tenderness and compassion for the younger self who was only ever trying to be good. Like we were just trying so hard to adhere and be good enough and to ensure our salvation or to be acceptable to other people. And when we can really just slow down and feel into that part of us that had that honest intention, um, you can feel a sense of like just tenderness or compassion towards that part of you.
Yeah.
So this is just talking about, how do we integrate? How do we reclaim our body, the self, and come into more connection? And the end goal of deconstruction isn't rebellion, although rebellion is perfectly fine. It is integration. It's trying to heal the split between the body and the spirit. Um,
And I just want to say too, rebellion might be necessary to get to integration. That the system restricted you and cost you things and took things away from you to the extent where you need to be able to have space to practice anger, vitriol,
mhm,
uh, hatred of the thing that did that to you, and
mhm.
be able to spit in its face by going and living your life the way you want to. Now, that comes with big risks. And if you don't make those kinds of choices real responsibly, you can end up with really additional unhealthy consequences for not making healthy choices in that stage. But I can completely understand why people need to spend time in that stage and why some people end up not making healthy choices. It really has to do with the trauma that they've gotten at the hands of the world around them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Um, so part of this integration process is learning, that desire, pleasure, and intimacy can be safe, they can be sacred, and they can be deeply human. Um, there are a lot of different things to explore around this. Like, I'm thinking of like tantric practices that sort of help you to get in touch with your body and sort of normalize sexual sensation, and rephrase it through this lens of like, it's just energy, it's life force energy, and learning how to sort of channel that and feel that and move with that. So sometimes those types of things can be really interesting and helpful for people. Um, Finding belonging that doesn't demand fragmentation. So finding a group of people that you feel fully, truly accept you just as you are. This is especially important for people in the LGBTQ plus community where, you're just allowed to be exactly as you are. And I think that community does that really well. Like there is such an openness and inclusivity that gives people a space to just come home to themselves, which I think is really beautiful. And then, one thing we say here a lot is returning to curiosity. So, curiosity is the antidote to shame. It's really the antidote to almost anything. When you can just stay open and curious, and being in curiosity takes you out of judgment. And so that's a really important part of it. And uh, I was going to read this quote. It says, "Leaving purity culture isn't just about rejecting a belief system. It's about remembering who you were before shame told you that your body was the problem." And I think that's really beautiful.
I love that. I hope that people listening to this have some space to sit with and explore uh, what they've been through over the course of their life, the messaging that they've gotten, the expectations that have been placed on them, the kind of human that they were told they needed to be, and that maybe this conversation is either initiates them, or it's a place along the way where they can deconstruct some more of those narratives and begin to step out as a more authentic version of themselves.
Yeah. Here are just a few books that people can maybe explore that are really helpful around this. I think Pure by Linda K. Klein is she was part of an evangelical church, and so she talks about her experience of sort of moving through that and emancipating herself. I've heard a lot of good things about Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski, um, and these are just books that are going to sort of help you repattern w- the experience of sexual shame and help you find ways to touch into a new relationship with yourself. Um, so yeah, if anyone is interested, they can kind of check some of these out. Any final thoughts that you have?
Yeah, we did the Come As You Are. I did that for a book club once, and it was a great book. I haven't seen any of the other ones, but they look interesting. The one you had there on the very bottom left, pure pleasure activism, looked interesting. So I'll check a few of these out myself. But uh, I think it's always good to be listening to conversations, reading books, and opening yourself up to information from whether it be experts or people who've had experiences in those places. Because I think that plays a huge role in us. Books have been 30% of what I would give credit to for the growth that I've experienced.
Hmm.
And so hopefully those books are helpful to the folks who take some time to read them.
Our website again. Bill and I do coaching, and we help support people through a lot of different aspects of this. Religious deconstruction, and I specialize in helping people on a more somatic lens. So being able to sort of start touching into your body to bring cues of safety, so that you can learn how to move through and process the emotional, echoes or remnants of trauma. And I, in particular, help people when this type of trauma manifests as different physical conditions. So, chronic pain, chronic fatigue syndrome, all kinds of crazy symptoms that can come up that, are mystery symptoms. That's sort of my expertise. And then I don't know if you want to talk about kind of the ways that you support people.
Yeah, I just got my certificate in the mail this week. I'm really excited to start this new adventure. For me, it really is just if people need general support, whether it is something going on in their life that they're affected from their childhood, maybe it's something in a relationship. But what I specialize in for sure is going to be people who are deconstructing or processing, having been in a high demand fundamentalist religion. I've spent a lot of time in my life meeting with people, whether it's over lunch. I've had a lot of get-togethers in my home to try to create a space where people could be vulnerable and feel safe, so that they could get the validation that they need, that they weren't crazy, and that they did experience a thing that was difficult and hard on them. But there are so many ills that come from being in a high demand religion that I think there's so many people out there who are affected in one way or another of that. And I really am looking forward to helping people specifically with that, but with general support needs as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And if people are interested in working with either one of us, you can go to awakenandthrive.org, which will also be in the show notes. And that will sort of give you, help you navigate towards one or another of us. So we hope everybody has a good rest of your week. Thank you for tuning in. We appreciate when you're able to sort of reach out and support us through the donation platform, which is something.
Yeah, donate to the podcast. It's almostawakened.org. And if you go to that website, you can click the donate button, and $5 a month, $10 a month is a big deal. And we really do appreciate those who support our work and support specifically this podcast. So if you like what you're hearing and you want to continue to have these conversations, then please go to almostawakened.org, click the donate button, and it'll give you a form there that you can fill out. It's really easy to do. So thanks so much for supporting the show.
Thanks, everyone, and take care.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Almost Awakened podcast. For more tools, resources, and real talk about conscious living, visit almostawakened.org. That's almostawakened.org, your resource for waking up